Hey, everybody.
Hello. How
Thanks
are you
so
guys?
much. How you guys doing? All right, we're going to go into the comments and make sure everybody can hear us.
Happy New Year,
Everything's
everybody.
good. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to everybody, and I hope it's a great year for all of us.
2026.
Woo-hoo.
Let's rock this bitch.
So, just a couple things before we get into this. Again, I want to thank everybody for your support. I want to thank everybody for your comments on the YouTube channel, on the videos. They mean a lot to us. The comments, the likes, the subscribers, it helps us all. It helps us, not you all, but it helps us to keep growing and to hopefully keep continuing this for you guys.
Yeah.
It's the best way for us to do that.
Hey,
Liz. We're excited
hey,
too.
Mary, what's going on?
Dawn from New
Amy.
Zealand. Woohoo!
What's
Rachel,
going on, everybody?
Happy New Year. The other thing is I want to be sure that everybody checked the post that I put up yesterday about the prizes from the premiere party. We sent out a load of stuff yesterday, but we still have a lot of names. If you scroll over, there's a list of names of people who won on the spins. And if you haven't gotten in touch with us yet to give us your address, please do so at info@voicesfromthegrave.com. Let us know your code name. Hey, Lori. Thank you for coming in.
What's up? Mwah.
So that we can get them to you. And if those prizes continue to go unclaimed, then we're going to do another giveaway pretty soon.
We're going to give them away again.
Hey, Australia's in the house.
What's going on?
Thank you,
exciting.
Audrey.
Thank you guys all for tuning in. We really appreciate this. It's going to be a fun night. Are you done with your
Yeah.
Just want to make sure before I jumped in. Please do that because we'd like to give the prizes away to people who won them. Hey, Joe Peretta's in the house, guys. Woo-hoo. Say hi to everybody.
So's David.
Hey, David and John. What's going on, guys?
Hi, Valerie.
Really super. Well, if you guys attended the premiere, you know that I revere this man, and he's a dear friend of ours, and he is an incredible person. He is an incredible detective, investigator. Lots of years at LAPD and homicide, 300 homicides. This man knows what he's doing. We're going to talk about his investigations into the Black Dahlia and into Zodiac tonight, which is going to be a hell of a conversation. And he's going to take your questions as we go, if we can do that. And I have a bunch of, like a good little journalist, I have my list of questions. I told him beforehand, and he said, I don't want to know what you're going to ask me. I like to go off the cuff. And that's why he's such a great guy, because he knows this stuff inside and out. And he is going to be telling you some really incredible stuff. If you're new to the Black Dahlia and Steve Hodel's work, if you're new to the Zodiac and work that he's done on that, this is going to be very eye-opening to you. And hi, everybody. I really appreciate you guys being here. So without further ado,
one second. Just one thing that I want to say about Steve. You guys met him in episode 1 at the Soden House, and that's where we met him. Yeah. And we were so lucky to have him walk us through not only the house itself from his childhood, but the crime scene itself, because we didn't know anything about it. You know, we got the Soden House 7 days before shooting, and it was a jam session for Karen and I.
I've never read a book so fast in my life.
Steve has written a series of books that if you have not read them yet, you have to, beginning with the Black Dahlia Avenger that started this whole thing in the public. Steve has been working on this case for decades. Mm-hmm. He has done an immense amount of investigation to prove his case, not only that his father killed Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, not only was he the killer of the lone women murders, but also the Zodiac. And he he gave us a very compelling case, and his books lay out a compelling case. If you're interested in the Zodiac part of it, that came out in Most Evil 1 and Most Evil 2. And hello from Michigan. Hello, Michigan. We love you guys. Thank you, everybody. And Cindy, yes, his books are great. I cannot recommend them enough. He's just come out with a brand new, what do you call it? Installment, I guess is what you would call it, the new Black Dahlia Avenger. And we just wanted to, because we can't cover it all in the episode, we wanted to kind of have Steve on and let him walk you through his case from top to bottom, because I think it's really important to understand how he comes to it. And like, you know, he and Karen said in the basement of the Soden, it's not just any one thing. You have to take his entire case, this massive decades-long investigation, and look at all of the evidence. And I think that you guys are going to be really overwhelmed to hear it all. So without further ado,
what I'd like to say is this is tonight. This is not about hot takes. There's a lot of speculation and stuff on these cases. This is not hot takes. This is what a sustained, decades and decades old investigation actually looks like from a man who damn well knows what he's doing. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce
hold
Steve
on,
Hodel.
one more thing.
Where's the man? He's gonna leave.
Here's one last note for you guys. When he came out with his first book, Black Dahlia Avenger, I want to be very clear on this. The Hodel secret transcripts from the wiretaps that they did between 1949 and 1950, for how many days, Karen?
41 days, 18 detectives, 24/7.
So when that was found, Steve had already come out with his book.
Yep.
So I want to be really clear that he didn't take those transcripts and go, okay, let me figure out how George Hodel did this.
Nope.
Instead, those came out afterwards. And I think that's some really compelling evidence.
All right.
Hello, New Zealand. Thank you for being here. Kansas. Thank you, guys.
Michigan,
Cheyenne.
Goodness.
Woo!
Awesome.
We got people from all over the place.
Amazing. I love it.
Thank you all for being here tonight. And now, without further ado, we will bring in
There's
Steve
the man.
Hodel. Woohoo! Hey, Steve.
Hi. Great to see you guys. Welcome to the great Northwest. I'm up in Birch Bay, Washington. And I understand you're getting more rain than we are now.
Yeah, it's been rainy.
But it's my favorite.
Drain the pool twice, for God's sake.
Yeah. It's great to be with you. Happy New Year to everyone.
You're my friend. It's great to see you too. My God.
Hey, Steve, I think one of the first questions that I'm seeing here from Emotionally Numb that may be a good thing to start off the whole ball rolling is, what got you to think your dad did this? And
Good
that's
question.
not,
Yeah.
So why don't we start there?
Okay, good question. Basically, I was living up here in Billington. I had retired from LAPD after 24 years and moved up to Bellingham, Washington, which is about 20 miles south of the border, Canadian border. And had my boys, young boys, and was happily retired. And got that 2 a.m. call that we all fear. It was June, my dad's wife in San Francisco, saying, and she was tearful and hysterical, saying, "Your father has just died. The paramedics are here. They just pronounced him dead. Come down." And I went down, flew down, did all the things you have to do to take care of the passing of a father. And I think it was day 2. I'm on the phone to my half-sister Tamar, same father, in Hawaii, and giving her a notification and stuff. And we're talking about the great man and his passing. And maybe, you know, if I could take a couple of minutes, I think it'd be good for your listeners and viewers to kind of get a understanding of who he was. Is that okay to do that? Because, you know, a few minute bio will kind of set the stage for him. You guys still with me?
Yeah,
absolutely. Please do.
Oh, okay. So basically, who was George Hill Hodel? Born in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, Clara Barton Hospital in 1907. Was living with his parents. He was an only child, living with his parents in South Pasadena, Monterey Road. At 9, he was a piano prodigy, playing his own piano concerts at the Shrine Auditorium. He was quickly identified as an exceptionally bright child, high IQ. He would be tested in high school. He would be tested and he would score 186 IQ, 1 point above Einstein. that skips a generation, but my boys are in good shape. And went to graduated at 14 from South Pasadena High. Went to Caltech at age 14. Actually, just turned 15. Was there a year. So not only is he highly intellectually intelligent and musically a prodigy, he also is sexually precocious. Has an affair with a professor's wife. She gets pregnant, and that breaks up her marriage. She goes back east, names the child Folly appropriately. And he goes back to east, says, I love you. I want to marry you. She says, George, you're a child yourself. Get out of my life. He comes back, passes himself off. Now he's 17. He passes himself off as 21. He's driving cab out of the Biltmore Hotel, of all places, downtown, with another young man who's going to law school by the name of William H. Parker, who will eventually become the chief of police of Los Angeles. I mean, talk about ironies. Mm-hmm. Anyway, then he becomes a journalist with the LA Record. And this is in the 1920s now. And he writes these tabloid stories. He's riding around with LAPD Vice during Prohibition. They're kicking doors, arresting the judge's wife with the young blonde. And then he graduates and starts writing around with LAPD Homicide on their cases. And he writes these, again, tabloid stories, the bloody ace of spades next to the body, this sort of thing. He does that for a year, and then he writes his own he starts his own magazine called Fantasia, which deals with surrealism, and it's a very artsy. It's an artsy magazine. That's short-lived. It only has a couple of editions, and he moves on. He hooks up with a young man by the name of John Huston, who at that point is just the son of a famous actor, Walter Huston, stage and screen. And they're double dating, and John is dating a woman by the name of Emilia. George is dating a woman by the name of Dorothy. A couple of weeks into it, they decide to switch, and Dorothy starts dating John. They wind up falling in love, getting married. They go off to the East Coast, New York, Greenwich Village. And George looks at Emilia and says, I guess it's you and me. She gets pregnant. They have a son named Duncan. And he goes north, pre-med at Berkeley for 4 years, graduate schools across to the Bay, to San Francisco, and graduates, gets his medical doctors at General Hospital there, goes off to New Mexico, Arizona, becomes the sole surgeon at a logging camp. Does that for about 9 months, then goes on, eventually comes back, joins LA Health Department, LA County Hospital, and rises to the top, becomes the VD czar, venereal disease czar of LA. And then basically gets arrested in 49 for incest with his daughter Tamar, my half sister, who was born in 35 with another affair he had. Anyway, he's arrested. There's a 3-week trial. He gets Jerry Geisler, who was the go-to guy and represented all the Hollywood stars back in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And they beat the case. They had three adults present during the sex acts who testified against George. Never mind. They basically painted Tamar, who was 14, with a lying, liar's brush, and he was acquitted. He then, in 1950, splits and goes to Hawaii, remarries, has 4 more children, goes to Manila, opens up a market research thing, becomes the leading expert in Asia, has 4 kids with a Filipino wife, Hortensia, ends that marriage, hooks up with June in late 60s, 1970, I think, 69 or 70. They eventually get married, come back to San Francisco in 1990. I start seeing Dad in 1990 for the last decade of his life. And let me make this very clear. I loved my father. I was very close to him in that last 10 years. You know, he'd been estranged before, obviously, but in that last 10 years, we became close. And then I get the phone call, go down and do what you have to do. And I'm talking on the phone with Tamar, and she says, so that's kind of a background. You can see what an unusual man he was. And I had tremendous respect for him, for his abilities. And basically, Tamar says, we're talking about the great man. His wife, June, always called him the great man. So we kind of did too, the great man. And I'm on the phone and she says, you know, he was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder. And I'm saying, where the F is this coming from, Tamar? What are you talking about? She says, well, he didn't do it, but he was a suspect. And the police that took me to court on the incest trial told me that they thought that he had killed Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. So that's a long answer to your question, but basically that's what started me. And I started out to show I said I can, with my background and experience, I can show he had nothing to do with it in 10 minutes. So I started investigating it, and the Black Dahlia, I knew it was a famous LAPD case, and we had seen the crime scene photos when I went through the academy in 1963. And I didn't even know her name, Elizabeth Short, but I knew it was a famous unsolved, and was confident I'd be able to show he had nothing to do with it. And eventually I would have to relocate back to Los Angeles and start my investigation. And I started it in 1999 and basically presented my evidence to the district attorney in secret in 2002. So that's a long answer to that question, but that gives you an idea of what the kind of person we're talking about here.
Before we go forward, we did have one question because we're still in the history of it. Jennifer Warner was asking about your other siblings at the time and what their beliefs were, and do they have any recollections of this, this whole series that you just went through?
No, nobody knew this. I mean, the only person that knew it was Tamar because of the incest trial. It came out during the trial. It was raised by the defense attorney. Apparently he had heard the rumor and he accused her of, that was one of the things that probably got Dad off in the trial, because, she's a liar. She's come up and made up all of this sex stuff, allegations. Not only that, and then the defense attorney brings it up. He says, isn't it true, Tamar, that you claim that your father killed the Black Dahlia? And her response was no, but he basically put it in the record. So, but to be clear, nobody knew, none of my siblings knew, and the only person that knew about this was Tamar. And the first time I heard about it was 15 years into retirement in 1999. So nobody had
for people who aren't professional investigators or retired detectives to understand, I want to put this on the record, and I want this to be extraordinarily hammered to everybody listening. You did not go into this to prove your dad did this. The last thing on the planet you wanted was when Tamar said Dad was a suspect in the Black Dahlia, and you went, what the F, Tamar? What the hell are you talking about? You said, I can prove that he wasn't in 10 minutes.
Right. You
went to this like any other investigation to disprove your theory, because that's how good investigations are done. You don't pigeonhole something because you think. You formulate a theory and your job is to disprove it, like science. And that's exactly how.
Yeah. But to be fair, there were two parts of me that were investigating this. There was a son who loved his father, and there was the trained investigator who was going to follow the evidence and was confident that it will show that it had nothing to do with him. But I kept an open mind. The detective was objective and followed the evidence, and the son was, also there as part of it. So it was I was kind of split in two, bisected as far as my pursuits.
Absolutely. Of course you were. Now, somebody's asking about the DA tapes, and we are going to get to that. It's one of my questions. Over 26 years, you've been working on this since 1999 now, right?
Yes.
Did any of your working theories, as we just discussed, change over those 26 years? Did you have to adjust the way that you thought through all your books, through all your investigations, and what were they?
Well, basically, I followed the evidence. The doors kept opening, and I've never had an investigation that's gone more than several years. So to have an investigation that's gone 25, 26 years, it's been incredible. And really, all the books are one ongoing investigation. There's Black Dahlia Avenger 1, 2, and 3, which are all like a homicide progress report, if you will. As new evidence came, I would write it up, and it would become a book 2 or book 3. As far as did I have to change anything in my investigation? Yes. One of the big controversies was in book 1, in Black Dahlia Avenger, the original book. There were several photographs, and we'll talk about my father's album that came up, which was critical to the investigation. But basically, the 2 photographs I claimed were the same individual. And then I did further investigation and actually found out that one of the photographs was definitely not Elizabeth Short. And so I had to retract that and make the evidence clear. I met with the individual in the photograph. Nobody else had ever talked to her to this day. She's passed on now. And I made it clear that I was wrong about that. So that's as important to do as making your points for the prosecution. It's also, when you're wrong, you say you're wrong. And I was wrong about the photograph. It was not her. And I eliminated on CNN, Anderson Cooper, publicly. I eliminated that photograph, I don't know, 4 years into it. So around 2008, 7 or 8 or something like that.
Okay, thank you. This is, again, the hallmark of a good investigator, because I've made mistakes. Steve's made mistakes. You own it, you apologize, and you move forward. And that, again, I'm trying to hammer home how objective you have been throughout all these years. And when you see something that's not right or wonky, you freaking handle it like a professional handles it.
Absolutely.
That's bring this home. I want to go into primary sources that you've used here, because there are a number of them. And primary sources, when you're doing an investigation, especially one this old, is really super important. So, like, what are the most important contemporaneous documents that has shaped your conclusions here? You've got the DA transcripts, which we're going to talk about right now if we can. Yeah. What other primary source documents have you used in your books that you can just sort of rattle off the top of your head?
Well, let's see. I had a handwriting expert do an analysis of handwriting on, of course, as we know, the killer, the Black Dahlia, who named himself Black Dahlia Avenger, sent in maybe 6 or 8 or 10 documents taunting the police and the press, cut and paste type things, and handwriting, and most of the handwriting was disguised. But there was one that was not disguised, and it was turning myself in on January 29th, had my fun at the police, signed Black Dahlia Avenger. And I recognized that was one of the first things that caught my attention, is I recognized that as my father's handwriting. And you know your parents' handwriting, your viewers know their parents' handwriting, and I knew Dad's. He has an unusual kind of printing. Usually he prints in an unusual style.
Right.
And I said to myself early on, I said, what the hell is he, what's going on here? Is he pretending to be the Black Dahlia? And I had handwriting expert, Hannah McFarland, certified court certified handwriting expert. Now, I'm not real big on handwriting. I've got to be honest with you. I think as a, it's okay to go along with the other evidence as long as but you certainly can't rely on handwriting by itself in a case. You need a lot of other evidence. And this was supplemental to all of the evidence I was building. And she came back positive on a number of letters. I think about 4 or 5. She came back and said highly probable, which is as high as you can go in handwriting without the original documents. So highly probable is virtually positive.
Right.
And to this day, nobody has countered that. They had one of the television, I think it was Black Dahlia Confidential. They hired their own handwriting expert, and he couldn't say no. All he could say was insufficient. Well, they gave him like two documents to look at, 2 or 3, and of course Hannah had 20 or 25 documents and samples of George Hodel's handwriting. So that was a biggie. I mean,
you've got internal memos from LAPD with your father's name on the suspect list. As a matter of fact, he's at the top of the list. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. So, and maybe let's explain how that unfolded, because Steve Lopez from the Los Angeles Times, I went to him before, and this was all, of course, I didn't go public with the information. I wanted to clue LAPD in first. So I requested a meeting with LAPD brass so I could present the case. But prior to that, I had presented all of the evidence to an active head deputy district attorney by the name of Stephen Kay. And he was one of the tops. I think he was number 3 from the top in rank. He had worked with Bugliosi on all of the Manson cases. In fact, Bugliosi did Manson, and Kay did all the rest of the family by himself. He prosecuted them all. So he was the best of the best. And I went to him. I was amazed he was still active on the DA's, with the DA. He was the head of the, I think, Long Beach division. And I went to him in secret and I said, hey, here's my evidence. Take a look at it, see what you think. I'd like your independent opinion on it. So he took 2 or 3 months to review all of the evidence and basically came back and said, well, the other thing, of course, the other big surprise, which we haven't mentioned yet, is not only was Dad the killer of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, but he was also a serial killer. And as I was investigating and looking at the case, reviewing all of the information, I discovered that there were multiple, what I call LA lone woman murder victims. They were all in a very tight geographical area between Hollywood and downtown LA, mostly, some in Long Beach, West LA, but pretty tight geographical pattern. And there were a dozen that I came up with that I felt were related. And LA, there's a lot of myth in this case. Needless to say, this is one of the cases that's got more myth than anything. And there are some major myths, one of them being that it was a standalone murder, none before and none after. You'll hear that from theorists, but go ahead.
It makes no sense.
Why does it make no sense that this was a standalone crime?
Well, because LAPD was investigating at least 5 of the murders as connected. And back in that day, they didn't have the term serial killer. They called them, what do they call them? They called them
chain murders.
Chain murders, that's right. Linked together, in other words. Thank you.
But also the fact that somebody doesn't kill that violently once in their life. And it's like you said during the Snowden interview, George didn't decide to become a serial killer at age, 35? So
Right.
it takes a mind of somebody who's been at this a long time and will continue on afterwards. For this to be a standalone crime is a little insane.
Well, exactly so. And ultimately, that's why I've got 10 books. Ultimately, I would write the early years, and I would discover, in my opinion, that he started as a teenager at age 14. Well, he had just turned 15. His first murder was I believe, in 1921, and it was a priest in the Bay Area, Colma, California, just outside of San Francisco. Gunshot, gunshot murder, and taunting letters to the San Francisco Chronicle in his voice, and basically, I've now presented 50 murders in 50 years. And he started out and basically never stopped. And I liken him to a wild beast, a tiger, a man eating tiger in the jungle. And the tiger's not going to stop killing until it's either captured or killed.
Right.
And Dad had a 50-year run from basically 1921 to 1969. I believe his last murder was Paul Stein in San Francisco, the cabbie in the Zodiac. And so basically, he had this history. And what's interesting is that the early murders prove the later murders, and the later murders prove the earlier.
Right.
Because
Go ahead.
the evidence, you
The
start
MO.
seeing, the MO, the evidence.
It doesn't, it shifts, yes, but it comes back. It's like this cycle. It's a very strange, like a satisfactory cycle he had. It was very odd to me to read how things came back. And it was like crimes of opportunity had this MO, and then crimes where he had time had this MO, and then other crimes had I think it depended on his psyche and what he wanted to do at that moment. He was so smart that he could switch MOs, and he didn't have like the handkerchiefs were one thing that was kind of a telltale sign through several of the murders that were left behind. So I don't.
Well, I present so I came out after. I guess we can talk a little bit about. So well, let me finish off with. So I go to the DA and Steve K in secret. He comes back and says, you're probably right about a lot of these other murders, but he says I have to be very objective about it. And he says, based on my experience, I would file on 2 of the murders. I would file on Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, and I would also file on Jean French, which was a murder that George committed just weeks after the Dahlia murder, and it was a kidnapping of a woman and strangulation, blunt force trauma, posing her body on a vacant lot about 5 miles west of the Dahlia crime scene in West LA, maybe a little farther, maybe 7 miles.
And scroll.
And basically posing. That was a big part of Dad's killings, was the posing. He in the French murder, he took lipstick and he wrote "fuck you" and signed it BD for Black Dahlia on her nude body, and then he covered it over he placed her clothing on top, so when the police arrived and took off the clothing, here was this message. And the message related to it's a lot to get into, but basically it was a response. They decided that they would set a trap for him and a false confession, and they had this Corporal Dumas, this military corporal, who came out with a supposed false confession that he killed the Black Dahlia, 14-page handwritten confession. And they published it. The newspapers were in on this. This was suggested by a couple of screenwriters who were family associates. Ben Hecht and Steve Fisher were 2 top screenwriters in Hollywood in that day. And there's a lot of Hollywood connections with my family, which maybe we'll have time to go into.
Yeah.
Anyway, they knew George did it. And they came out separately in separate articles in the newspaper after the Dahlia killing, saying, I know the name of the killer, and the police will have him in custody soon. They were confident. And they knew it was George Hodel. And same with Fisher. He said, I know the name of the killer too. And Fisher comes up with this idea of, if you say, if you have somebody claim they killed the Black Dahlia, that out of his response would be he'd give himself up in response. Well, what does George do? So they do this, and big headlines, Corporal Dumas confesses to Black Dahlia, 14-page confession. And they're right. It really pissed George off, but he didn't turn himself in. He went out and killed a woman and wrote, "Fuck you, BD," on the body. So that was his response, as opposed to turning himself in.
Yeah, not quite the, quite.
And also, you look at those two murders so close together, so close in proximity together.
That's right.
It's really, it's great circumstantial evidence beyond everything else that you found with that. To go, how did you not see that this is, even if you're LAPD and refuse to look at George Hodel, how do you not see this as the same killer?
Right.
Well, actually, they did. The captain of Homicide, Jack Donahoe, came out and said these crimes are related. It's the same killer. And again, a lot of this is lost in, the history and the myth. A lot of other theorists have to make it a one-on. They can't have additional killers. It doesn't work for their theories. So, and between movies, books, the real truth has been buried. But originally, LAPD was looking at about 4 or 5 of these as chain murders, and that's lost too. That's lost in the fog of myth and distortion.
So
go ahead.
We've got all of this. We've got chain murders. We've got Stephen K., who said he would file an information, and he said I would get a guilty verdict on George Hodel for Elizabeth Short and Jean French. Correct?
Right.
Okay.
He said I would file on this. I would present it to a jury, and I'd win it in a jury trial. He came right out publicly and said that. And this isn't some fuzz that was or retired DA. He was active at the time.
That's right.
And highly respected. And so maybe we should talk a little bit about how the real hard evidence, some of the hard evidence unfolded.
Yeah, I think transcripts is a huge question for people. Can we talk about those, Steve? Tell us how you found them and what those meant to your investigation, because it kind of flipped the script in a big way for you.
It did. So I'm trying to get a meeting with LAPD with the DA, with Steve K. And the two of us are trying to get a meeting. They keep putting us off. And this is late 2002. And the book is scheduled to come out in, April of 2003.
Yeah.
I think it was April. And so they keep putting us off, they schedule it and then they cancel it. And we're getting closer and closer to the pub date. And I'm worried about this. So I go in secret it wasn't in secret. He was giving a book talk on one of his own, this Steve Lopez. And he was a columnist, still is, I think, a columnist for the LA Times. And I had him a copy of the pre-pub book. And I said, take a look at this. I think you'll find it interesting. So he comes out, we keep getting put off by LAPD, and now it's published time. So the book comes out, and Lopez comes out simultaneously with a column saying, hey, this guy's come to me, he's ex-LAPD, he's claiming his father, daddy did it type thing. And it was kind of, I don't know if this guy's a nut or whatever, but it was kind of reserved, but he made it public. And then he has, a few days later, he writes a second column, which is much more positive, and said, well, here's the deal. I I went to LAPD and said, "Hey, Hodel, retired LAPD, daddy is a Black Dahlia killer, blah, blah, blah." And they said, "We're not interested. We don't want to talk about it. It's an active case," right? Yeah. 50-year-old active
It
case.
was radioactive because the press has to make nice with the police. Let's be honest.
I like that, radioactive. It was radioactive.
Absolutely.
And so then cases. Then I went to the head to Mr. DA, who blanking on his name, Steve Cooley.
Yep.
So I go to DA Cooley, and he says, "Well, I'm not spending a dime, looking at an old case like that." And then Cooley says, "But there is a box, a file on the Black Dahlia in the vault. Do you want to see that?" Lopez says, "Yeah." They go down to the vault, open it up. Cooley hands him this box on the Black Dahlia. Lopez goes upstairs, sits down in the office, opens it up, opens the file, and out falls a picture of Dr. George Hill Hodel. He goes, "Whoa, he was a suspect." Anyway, what's also in there is a 146-page transcript. And what we learned, so basically, he does a quick and dirty follow-up in the second column. Says, "Well, his father was a suspect, and blah blah blah," but he doesn't really go into any depth or anything. So I go down and talk to the DA's office and say, "Well, I'm the son. Can I see the file?" And to my surprise, they said, "Yeah, I guess so. We let him do it. I guess we should let you." And I copy everything. I spent an entire day down there, and with a good friend, the producer of Black Dahlia Confidential, was the first thing that came out shortly after. And David Browning was the producer, top guy, and he and I copied everything, took it home, and I sat down and spent several weeks reviewing the material. And what do we discover? We discover that LAPD had George Hodel as the prime suspect back then. What happened was and they were also the LA Lone Woman murders, and none of these were being solved. So the grand jury took the Dahlia investigation away from LAPD and gave it to the DA's office. And you've got to also understand, it's important to understand that 1940s was a whole different world than today or even yesterday. There was a lot of corruption, payoffs. There were all sorts of things going on. There was a big scandal about an abortion ring that was headed by a couple of sergeants on the vice squad, huge abortion ring payoffs. All sorts of things were happening, and it had been going on from the 20s and the 30s, very corrupt LAPD. And it wasn't until 1950 when Parker took over that things started to change, and he was going to get rid of the corruption and clean up Dodge, so to speak. Anyway, so with that as a background understanding, the grand jury takes the case away and says, "We want the DA's office to investigate it." And Lieutenant Frank Jemison is put in charge of the investigation. And he puts together a team, and they're going to stake out George Hodel's house and his person. And LAPD starts screaming and saying, "Wait a minute, we want to be on board on this. It's not fair. So Jemison agrees, and they decide that they have an 18-man team. Mm-hmm. And they set up a stakeout. They go and they pick up George Hodel, and they take him down to the Hall of Justice for questioning. And everybody thinks, and this may be new to you guys, but everybody thinks, although there's not much new to you two, is there? Anyway, everybody says that, well, George Hodel was just a doctor, and they were checking all doctors. That's why he was checked out and eliminated quickly.
Bullshit.
Total bullshit. Not so. What happened was they didn't even do the stakeout on the Dahlia case. what happened was in June of 49, there was a murder of a Louis Springer.
Yep.
And they received information that George had committed that crime. And so when they were doing the stakeout, it was actually, I mean, when they were doing the stakeout, it was actually on the Springer case, which was what, 5 months before the Dahlia murder. No, I'm sorry. It
No.
was, I'm saying 49. It was, anyway, that was the reason for the stakeout in 49, not the 47
right.
Dahlia case. So what they do is they pick up George and they take him down to the Hall of Justice for questioning. And while he's downtown, the bugmen from LAPD and the DA's office go out. And they actually jimmy the door and get into our home, which is many of your viewers are probably familiar with it. Well, they should be. They saw it on your show. The Souden House, 5121 Franklin Avenue. And they go inside and they don't wiretap the phone. They actually put hard microphones in the walls. They drill holes and they actually conceal them in the walls, one in the living room, one in the bedroom. And they run a hard line through the basement. They connect that to the Pacific telephone lines, which run to Hollywood Station, which is about 3 miles away. And they go into the basement of Hollywood Station on Wilcox, where I worked as a detective for 17 years. And they set up a tape recorder, a wire recording. They had wire recordings in those days, not tape. And 18 detectives, 24/7, 2-man teams listening in around the clock. And they tape it for 6 weeks in 1950, starting on, I believe it was February 15th, they put in the wire recordings, and they started on the 18th. And they run it for 6 weeks.
Nailed it.
And what do they get? They get a whole bunch of admissions and cop-outs on the different teams during different hours. They get Dad saying, well, of course, he knew he was a suspect. Yeah, go ahead.
You ready? If you guys want to get a copy of this book, it's available online. And I'm going to read this verbatim on page 26. Page 20 on the live wire microphone. George Hodel. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. Next page, 27. Hodel talking to a man with an accent, possibly German. Telephone men were here. Operator realized there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Call Georgia Receiving Hospital right away. Expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
But it doesn't stop there. There is so
it goes
much
on and on and on.
But there's so much in there. We hear a woman screaming, getting hit by a pipe.
Yes.
They hear digging. They hear your father and
the Baron
von Haringa, who was his friend and visiting that particular night, amongst many others, saying, "Don't leave a trace." And I think that, the other really important thing about these transcripts and why they came about, you hit on it a little bit, Steve. There were so many murders, and as you said during this, our first episode, the Soden episode, was that bodies were literally piling up all over Los Angeles, and LAPD wasn't solving any of them.
Right.
And you had to ask yourself, why? Why weren't they solving these? And I think it goes back to the corruption, and that possibly, in my opinion, George Hodel was involved in them, and he had so much power. And I think that that's something that people we haven't touched on that yet, was the amount of power that George Hodel held, because he was head of the venereal disease in Los Angeles County in the health department. If you got VD back then, If you were an actor, if you were a studio head, if you were a cop, if you were a mobster, if you were a madam or a call girl, prostitute, you saw George Hodel.
Got that right.
If you needed an abortion, you saw George Hodel. He's got the dirt on everybody. And I believe that you stated in one of the books that when your mother, Dorero, was talking to him about his black book, he said, where do you think all this money comes from? So when you think back on LAPD shutting down and not wanting to talk about George Hodel or to expose him or why this maybe got pushed under, you have to remember how powerful this man was back then. And he had the dirt on everybody. The stars, the studios, the mobsters, the police, the madams, you name it.
Politicians, everybody.
The politicians.
Judges, all of them.
He was the most powerful man, whether elected or not, in this city, in my opinion.
Yeah, he had a lot of power.
Of course.
Sure did, yeah.
That's true. And maybe we should talk a little bit about exactly what he had on who.
Yep.
And again, you have to go, it wasn't until I got into the early years that I started to see how it all came together. And basically, well, first of all, in the taped, in the wire recordings, he also talks about, he admits performing abortions at his clinic. He had a clinic at downtown on First Street. Just incredibly, to give you an idea how doors keep opening, I just blogged recently on a new discovery where LAPD's office, the personnel office, was literally 2 doors down from his First Street clinic. I mean, they were literally next door to George during those years. Anyway, as far as what he had, he admits on the wire recordings to performing abortions. He admits to police payoffs. He says this is the best payoff between law enforcement I've ever seen. He admits so he was performing abortions for the rich and famous, for the politicos of that day, for cops whose girlfriends got in trouble. No problem, go see Dr. George. So you're right, he had all of that. But there was more. There was, well, first of all, let's talk about I'm reading the transcripts when I first got them, and I got to that section where I'm reading, this woman is upstairs and she's clearly drugged and she's trying to phone the operator for help and she's unable to make a connection. And I'm reading this in the transcript the officers have written. And then nothing for 3 hours or 4 hours. Then I'm reading and it says, I identified this German accent guy as Baron Harenga is his name. He was an artist friend of, well, he had an art house downtown, friend of George's. And I'm reading it, it says the George and the German guy go downstairs to the basement. A pipe is heard hitting, more blows, a woman screams, more blows, a woman screams again. And I'm reading this and I'm saying, what the fuck? Why aren't they out the door? They're 4 miles away. They could be there in 5 minutes or less. You know, why aren't these guys out the door and doing a rescue? They did nothing.
Right.
And so it's either a felony assault, and more likely, I'm convinced it was a murder, and not just me thinking that. They thought it was a murder too, because the DA detective later contacts a plumber and says, "Did you see any graves or digging in the basement?" And the guy says, "Well, I was just there to fix the plumbing in the basement. I wasn't looking for graves." So clear, and this is documented. So clearly they thought that there were graves, and maybe we're on that subject. Should we talk about the Buster? Should we?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we should. But a couple things that I think in everybody's mind and in my mind, and certainly, why do you guys think the police just never responded to this call?
Well, that's a good question, and I've wondered that myself. And I think probably, giving them the best credit I can, I think that probably they're hearing this and they're looking at each other and saying, "What do we do?" You know, should we call it Jemison? And maybe they tried to call Jemison. Now they're just 3 days into this. Occurred only on the third day of the stakeout.
Yeah.
And I think maybe they're thinking to themselves, well, we don't want to blow the stakeout, and he's into kinky sex and stuff. Maybe this is just, and it's all quiet now. So maybe we'll just, and maybe they tried to phone Jemison and couldn't reach him. Who knows? But for whatever reason, they didn't respond. But giving them the best.
For all time, I think.
I think between permission, agency, and bias, you're right, Steve. Their agency was not to do patrol function and search and rescue. They were there to listen to a wiretap. Right. And I think that their bias, they allowed themselves to believe that everything was just okay. It's something weird, but I think maybe deep in the pit of their gut, they knew something was wrong, but they, like you said, they didn't know what to do. They couldn't get Jemison on the phone, or they didn't have permission to leave their post. And we're both military. You don't leave your post until properly relieved, right?
Right.
So maybe that was part of it.
I think it was. I'd like to give them that much credit because I mean. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of both. Audrey, you questioned why take George's conversations if he had that much power. You have to go back to the fact that LAPD had this case ripped away from them by the grand jury. So LAPD didn't have any choice. Now, the LADA's office maybe weren't in as deep as LAPD. And then Steve, why don't you touch, and then we'll go back to Buster. The killing stopped because why? After these wire.
They didn't, but they did for a little while.
Yeah. So George is tipped off by a couple of insiders, and he splits. He leaves the country in 1950. Shortly afterward, he sells the Souden house. We're off with Mom on our own. Of course, they had been divorced a long time. We were living there kind of at his pleasure. And we weren't living there full time at the Souden house. It was in and out, off and on through the years. And Mom's, we probably don't have time to go into Mom's whole history, but she was a remarkable woman, beautiful, married. She wound up marrying John Huston for 7 years, and then they divorced, and she went out of the frying pan into the fire and married George. And we were 3 brothers were born to them in the late 30s, early 40s. And they were actually divorced. She divorced him for cruelty in 1943 or 44. I think it was final in 45. So they were divorced, and we were living there at his pleasure off and on from 45 when he bought the house to 1950 when he split. So he split. He knew that he had to get out of Dodge. Jemison. Now, there's only one guy that I've been able to find in all of this that has a white hat, and that's this Lieutenant Jemison that we're talking about, the DA investigator. And he knew that he knew he had solved the case, and maybe we should deal on that. He was ordered by the then DA, who I'm blanking on his name right now. Short-lived. He was only DA for a few years.
No.
Anyway, he ordered him to shut it down, stop the investigation, and personally hand deliver. He ordered Jemison to hand deliver all of the tapes, the transcripts, everything to Thad Brown, Chief of Detectives, LAPD. And I've got a whole history on Thad Brown, and so he did exactly that. He had no choice. He was about to arrest George. He was literally putting the case together and going to go get a filing when he was ordered by the DA to shut it down and turn everything over to Chief Thad Brown, Chief of Detectives.
Right.
So he did it and turned everything over, the tape recordings, and of course they mysteriously disappeared from the files. Everything about George Hodel, all of the 146-page transcripts, the actual recordings, everything disappeared, and LAPD knew his name was nowhere to be found.
Right.
So the following, in the following generations, in the decades that followed, nobody knew George Hodel was even mentioned. The name never came up. He was never a suspect as far as LAPD was concerned, because nobody knew about it other than the cops that had worked it, and they were, of course, part of the cover-up.
And I'd
So
like
the cover-up can go directly to Thad Brown, and there's a reason why Thad Brown had to cover it up. And if you want me to tell you that now, or you want to wait.
I know why, but please tell the audience, because it's really important.
Okay, so basically, as after completing my investigation, I'm still working it, but after thinking I got it all together, I start looking at Dad for other crimes. And what do I discover? I discover he committed a crime prior to the Dahlia. Well, basically, the lone woman murder started in 1943 with a woman by the name of Ora Murray. And I've got a dozen murders from 43 to when he splits in 50, and then suddenly all the murders of lone women stop. So he splits and goes to Hawaii, which was a territory back then. And as I start looking at him, I said, well, he didn't wake up at age 39 and decide to be a serial killer. So I knew there had to be stuff before, and I had during my investigation, I'd come across indications, but never really got into it because I was focused on the 40s. So once I felt I had pretty much presented all the evidence on the lone woman murders and the Dahlia, what do I discover? I discover that the early years, I begin looking at the early years, and I discover a crime in the late 30s that occurred. And Thad Brown back then was a lieutenant in Homicide. And they had 3 little girls called the Inglewood Babes that were kidnapped and murdered, raped and murdered in the hills on the west side of Los Angeles. And Inglewood PD was handling the investigation. But Lieutenant Thad Brown got involved in the investigation, went down, and he somehow focused on this young crossing guard. He brought him in for questioning, and says, he's a crossing guard. He knew the girls. He walked them across the street when they went to school and stuff. Well, he turns this crossing guard over to Inglewood PD. The crossing guard's got an IQ of 70, and he's in his 20s. And basically, they take him in Inglewood and they grill him and they say, "You killed these girls, didn't you?" He says, "No, I didn't." So after a lot of questioning and God knows what, there's a mob outside, and they're threatening to hang him as a suspect. Anyway, they get him. They said, "Look, we'll turn you over to the mob if you want, or you can tell us the truth and tell us that you killed them, didn't you?" So naturally, they get a confession out of this,
Poor kid.
I don't know what the term is, mentally challenged. And he's sent. They try him, they convict him, and they execute him. All within a year or less. Public outrage. He was innocent, but they had a defense team for him, but nothing. He's executed. So George, being the actual killer of those 3 little girls, along with an accomplice, Fred Sexton, who we haven't talked about, but was a good friend of George's, and they grew up and serially killed together, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he had that on Thad Brown, and it was a wrongful prosecution, execution of an innocent young man.
Mm-hmm.
So he had that on Brown, and then of course he also had the murder that he committed while they're listening to the tape recording. And when he splits, Thad Brown is the first one to be super glad that he's left town and he's gone. And basically, they covered it up. Thad Brown took all of the evidence, removed it. Well, I can't say that because I don't know for a fact, but let's put it this way. he was handed everything and it all disappeared
There
from
you
the records.
So
Yeah.
much from all of these cases has disappeared.
But I would like to point something out, Steve. Okay, two
Sure.
things. Going back to those wiretaps, people are still asking. I want to be clear. The reason they could install them is because George Hodel had been yanked downtown for questioning. He wasn't at the house. They
No.
shimmed the door. They went in, installed the microphones while he's downtown being questioned. That was one question. Second time, I want people to understand this. Police departments do not install live microphones in people's homes without a really good reason to do so. And they don't monitor it for 41 days, 24/7, and install 18 detectives around the clock. This was a huge deal. They used 2 to 3 miles of wire. They had to get the wire, they had to get the microphones, they had to spend the time, they had to get George out of there, they had to install them, they had to make sure they weren't detectable, they had to go down to Hollywood Station and listen to those microphones. And after it was all over, and they got what they got on these pages and pages of transcripts, Lieutenant Jemison took the time to duplicate these transcripts and hide them in a vault in the DA's office because he damn well knew when he turned everything over, he sniffed suppression, he sniffed it out, and he knew that it was not going to work out that way. And he hid those files for 50 some odd years until Steve found them in the DA's vault. So you tell me all that work for one person who didn't mean anything, not only in the Dahlia case, but in the Jean French case and in the Louise Springer case, that's 3 right there. That's a serial killer. End of file.
Yeah.
Period. That is textbook definition, and you take all the rest out. Isn't 3 enough for anybody? Really?
Yeah, excellent. And also, he was ordered to clear George Hodel as one of the suspects he had a list of 20 suspects initially, and really they're calling them suspects, but really what they were persons of interest is really what they were. They didn't have,
I don't.
You don't until you really focus.
They didn't do this at anybody else's house.
Yeah.
Nobody else's house. Just the Soden house and George Hodel. Not one other person they put this amount of effort into. Lieutenant Jemison was not a stupid man. He was wired in. He's at the DA's office. He'd been doing it a long time. And he brought along, I want to point this out because it's important for me. Walter Morgan was another investigator that Jemison handpicked. Walter Morgan had only been at the DA's office a couple of months before Jemison handpicked him. And here's my theory, Steve, and I can't prove it. The reason he picked Walter Morgan is because Walter Morgan married a woman named Sugar Geis. And Sugar Geis was best friends with gangster Mickey Cohen's wife. And Mickey Cohen's wife was the matron of honor at Walter Morgan and Sugar Geis's wedding. So Walter Morgan was also friends with Sheriff Biscaluse of the LASO. So Walter Morgan knew the inner workings, not that he was dirty. He knew the inner workings of the vice. He knew the inner workings of how this stuff functioned. And so I think he was handpicked by Jemison on purpose because he was linked in and had knowledge of all the working parts and machinery of Los Angeles in that era. That's just my theory.
And before we leave the transcripts, want to go back to Buster and Resolve, because I think that when you took a cadaver dog, a search and rescue dog, Buster, back to the Soden house, and he hit on quite a few places. And I think it's really important to understand that we have women who disappeared from this time period, never to be found. A lot of young women disappeared. But we also have the woman who got hit over the head, or sounded like it got hit over the head with a pipe. So LAPD, or at least the LADA's office, like Steve said, we're asking plumbers, hey, did you see any freshly dug vein? So all these years later, Steve goes back with Buster and tell us what happened, Steve.
Yeah. Okay. Just one point of clarification. One of the things that I was concerned about was, well, in the DA reports, they interview my mother, Dorothy, and she indicated that we weren't there during that time period. In other words, we were staying with her brother, my uncle, in about 5 miles away during that time period. So we weren't there. So the Sound House was, George was the only one in the Sound House during this stakeout period, just to be clear. So getting to Buster, so I get an invitation to, they were doing a paranormal show or something, I believe it was.
Ghost
What was it?
Ghost Adventures, I think.
Ghost Adventures. And they asked me to come and maybe give a history of the house, and that they had hired a cadaver dog, and they wanted to do a search. So I thought, well, that's okay, I'll do that. So I went over and met with Paul Dostie, was the trader, retired police officer, and his dog Buster. So we're out front, and he gives the command for Buster to alert. Buster takes off running up the steps. He goes over and he alerts at a corner of the house, which is actually the basement. So we're down below. There's about, you've seen it, you know how it is. We're down below at street level. So when Buster runs up, he alerts at this corner house exterior of the basement. We go inside, we go into the basement. He alerts at 4 different places in the basement on the dirt. We collect soil. Later, we collect soil samples, and they're analyzed, and they come back for positive for human remains. And Buster doesn't alert on dead rats or anything. He only alerts on human remains. So what have we got? We got Buster saying, they're human remains at some time were here, blood, whatever it is. We've got the DA saying, documenting that they're investigating with a plumber that they believe that there are graves in the basement, and and then we've got the soil analysis coming back positive for human remains. So there's no question that at some point in time, if not still, there were dead bodies, human remains in the basement. There's no question about that. And
getting to missing women and possibilities, although I don't think this is one. But one person asked, Alexa asked, if you feel like it was George or the mob with Jean Spangler and her disappearance. And why do you think it was George?
So Jean Spangler was, again, it's circumstantial and her, not enough to file a case, but she's one of the LA Lone Woman murders, very attractive young actress. And I discover, what do I discover? I discover that she is talking to an actor friend of hers. It wasn't Kirk Douglas, it was, I'm blanking on, do you remember the name?
Kirk Douglas was on set with her, and he said he barely remembered speaking with her, but yeah, it was Kirk Douglas.
There was another actor that Robert Cummings.
Robert Cummings, you're right. Yeah.
And she's talking to him, and she says, I'm having a hell of a time. This is right during the dad's trial. She says, I'm dating this new guy, and I'm just having a hell of a time, and I'm loving it. She doesn't say his name or anything, or what he does, but she just says, I'm just loving it. Then I discover that on the night of her disappearance, she's on a date with a man who meets her at the a Hollywood market across the street from Man Ray's residence apartment, which is a whole other factor that we probably won't have time to get into. But Man Ray was a surrealist artist, famous surrealist artist, and good friend of my father's, and he was actually our family photographer, if you will. Anyway, across the street, this man and her meet, and she goes on to dinner at a local restaurant in Hollywood with him. Another man comes, who I think was Sexton. I think it was George, and they come and meet at the restaurant. Then there's an argument. And apparently in this restaurant, there's a radio guy that does his live radio show from the restaurant. He starts to approach her. She's a fairly well-known bit part actress, very attractive. So he starts to approach her to interview her, and the man, who I think was George, waves him off like, And then he veers off and walks away. Anyway, there's an argument. They start yelling at each other. They leave the restaurant. Shortly thereafter, there's a man and a woman at a gas station, and it's Jean Spangler, and she's yelling and saying, "Get the license plate, I need help." And the car drives off after
Have
gas.
a car.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and then her purse is found in Ferndale Park, or not Ferndale, in
Ferndale Park.
Was it Ferndale?
Yep.
In Ferndale Park, which is just like a mile behind the Souden house. And it's found there, and they find a note that indicates that she maybe.
Quick, before you gloss over that, why Ferndale Park is important to your family? Because George took you guys there as kids, correct?
Yeah, it was our favorite hangout. It was there's a big creek in the park there, and we'd hunt for frogs and play. As young kids, we'd play there all day. Dad would drop us off at Ferndale, so
Yep.
it was basically our backyard as kids,
Right.
And so there's a note indicating that she was getting an abortion, about to get an abortion.
It said something along the line of, "Kirk, I can't do this anymore. We'll be best while Mother's away, going to see Dr. Scott."
Yeah, right. So I believe that, again, it's all part of his crime signature. I believe that she was dating George, handsome doctor, charming, erudite, sophisticated. She's just having the time of her life. And what's particularly pointed is the fact that this occurred the day after he gets charged with incest with
Right.
Tamar. So I believe what it was she was going to inform on him in regards to Tamar, and that he decided to, shut her up. I mean, it's not I don't think it's coincidental that it happened the very day after he bails out on the incest charge, and then
the only one.
She
She's not the only one that was going to inform on him. Lillian Lenorak was another one, and she was shut up really quickly.
Yeah, poor Lillian. Again, another incident at the Souden house. Lillian Lenorak was staying at the house, and I don't know if she was an actual girlfriend of George's or not, but she had a young boy who was, I think, 3 or 4 years old. And basically, there was an incident where she knew that George had killed Elizabeth Short. And I think this was just after, this was shortly after he beat the case, the felony case. He was acquitted on it. So she goes and she gets his rifle from his bedroom, and she's waiting to shoot him and kill him. He's got to pay for what he did. And one of the tenants, Joe Barrett, sees her in there, and he's talking to her. And George comes home. Anyway, the two of them disarm her from the rifle. She's knocked to the floor. We have testimony from the little boy later that he was bad and knocked mommy down and hit her knocked her to the floor. Anyway, he drugs her, probably an injection or something. She's unconscious. He stages a fake suicide, cuts her wrists lightly, bandages it, and a policewoman from Santa Barbara is called, who was called by the mother of Lillian Lenorak, who was living in Santa Barbara and was estranged from her daughter, Lillian. And she comes down and picks and, says, "What's the deal?" And George says, "Well, she was hysterical and she attempted to commit suicide. She's mentally unstable." So the policewoman, Mary Unkiefer was her name, drives her back to Santa Barbara with the little boy and wants to take her and release her to her mother. Well, her mother says, "I'll take the boy, but I want nothing to do with her." So Kiefer says, what do I do now? I guess, anyway, she winds up taking her to Camarillo, which was the state hospital, for observation because she was mentally distressed.
Right.
I'd be mentally distressed too.
Yeah, no kidding.
But
and then Kiefer writes a long letter, 2-page letter, handwritten letter to the DA, laying out this whole story because Lillian becomes conscious on the drive back, and it tells her she didn't attempt suicide. George did it. He drugged her and he cut her wrists.
Right.
And one reason she probably wasn't murdered is because she could be so easily tied to George. So what better way than to dispatch her with a couple superficial, slices of the wrist, drug her, and carry her off to Camarillo State Hospital where nobody's going to believe her anyways. And that's a little bit of his MO too, because he did the same thing with Tamar, of, showing her to be nothing but a pathological liar when all along she was not lying at all.
Exactly. And the sad part with Lillian is a few years later, she was a actress, she bit parts, very attractive woman, and she's dating a doctor, and they drive out to Palm Springs, and they get into an argument in the car. She's dating this guy, this doctor, and they get in an argument. She gets out she says, "Stop the car," and she gets out, and he drives off. He goes back to the hotel. Anyway, this guy comes and picks her up, kidnaps her, and murders her.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's sad life, and
survives George Hodel only to be murdered years and years later.
I want to address one question that I see here. Karen is incorrect. Mark Hansen was also bugged. It's in the LADA files. Wasn't only Sodenhouse and George. No, you're right. Tons of people were bugged. You can go to the Earl Canet files. There are over 50 houses that were bugged during that era. My point was that there are no other DA files where it's 41 days, 18 detectives, 24/7, where they installed live microphones and monitored them at Hollywood Station. They did not do that with Mark Hansen. They did that with George Hodel.
There were lots of, Karen has researched, all the mafia and the LAPD ties and how many people were bugged. Yes, that's natural, but like Karen said, not for 50 days, not 24/7, not with 2 live wires. Most of them had phone bugs or things like that. This was
Mickey Cohen was bugged. I'm sure that a lot of police officers were bugged. You had Mark Hansen that was bugged. These are phone taps. Sometimes they would have a live mic, but they were not monitoring it with 18 detectives for 41 days.
Yeah.
It just didn't happen. That was a huge undertaking for Lieutenant Jemison and Walter Morgan and the others to do. And there was a purpose behind it. That was my whole point. Not that other people weren't bugged. Of course they were. The entire city was bugged at that point.
There was so much corruption, and Mark Hansen was certainly, we get into him a little bit in the episodes. We got into him a little bit in episode 2. We get into him more a little bit later. But yeah, there was so much corruption and so much bugging, but no doubt about it. One thing I want, go ahead. No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that in regards to the bugging, of course, back then they didn't need a warrant, to do it. There was, today you'd have to have a warrant. You'd have to establish probable cause and everything. Back then, they didn't need that. And Walter Morgan, that you mentioned, Karen, is actually the one that Jimmy. They couldn't open the door; it was locked. Right. And he's with him, and he says, "Well, there's no problem." And he takes out a knife or whatever, and he jimmies the door for him and gets in, and they go in and they wire it for sound. But let's see, there was something else I wanted to talk about. So let's talk. Maybe we should talk about the letter, some of the physical evidence that I was able to connect, much to my surprise.
Yeah, you just came out with a new book. What is the new evidence in your newest installment of the Black Dahlia Avenger? What caused you to do this new book, and what have you found in between all of these books that's the newest evidence?
Okay. Well, the new book just came out a few months ago, November, and it's basically an update of the original Black Dahlia Avenger, and I added, I think, 120 new pages of investigation in that. And some of that has been covered in the other books, BDA 2 and 3, but some of it hasn't. So it's I probably won't get, other than you two, I probably won't get too many people reading 10 books, but they will read one book. And so I put a lot of the linkage and the new evidence in the one book, which is Black Dahlia Avenger, but updated. And one of those was actual, I was able, much to my surprise, was able to link physical evidence from the Sowden house, our home, to the crime scene. And how did that happen? So who built the Sowden house? Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., son of Frank Wright, Lloyd Wright, actually designed and built the Sowden house in 1926 for Mr. and Mrs. Sowden. And I thought, and then I discovered that he had a file at UCLA records, UCLA campus, their records there. So I went down to the basement and I got it. And you have to put on the white gloves, the whole bit. And I'm looking through Frank Lloyd Wright Jr.'s file. And I'm opening it up, and here's an inner file, Dr. George Hodel. I go, whoa. Well, I knew, he built, there's a connection that he bought the house that Frank Jr. built. So I'm going through it, and what do I find? I find receipts for cement bags and fertilizer, manure, in the file. And it's dated 3 days before the murder. And it's work that was done, cement work that was done at the house in 1947. And I think, holy cow. So I've got receipts, and I knew that the body, and LAPD established this, that the body was transferred from an unknown location, probably a private residence, her body parts, her two halves, were transported using these cement and fertilizer bags. And he posed the body as he did, as seen in pictures carefully, and he just left the cement and these large 50-pound bags of cement and a bag of fertilizer right next to the body. You see him in the photographs. So go ahead.
To me, that is a huge evidence, because you've got crime scene photos that were taken decades ago. You've got stuff listed within the Lloyd Wright files at UCLA. So what everybody has to understand is George Hodel buys the house in 1945. He wants to do some remodels on it. He brings Lloyd Wright back in to do these renovations and fix up the landscaping and reinforce some of the stuff. And that's how these files end up at UCLA. And that's how there's the Hodel Lloyd Wright. And as Steve's going through them, he notices that there's the manure bag and the concrete bag that there's receipts for this. And those they're so vivid in these photographs, and the crime scene photographs of Elizabeth Short. I mean, what are the odds against that?
Bandolini manure.
Astronomical.
One of your armchair detectives found that Bandolini manure thing
Right.
in that photo. It was amazing.
I've had a lot of help from so-called armchair detectives. I tell you, some of these guys and gals could be my partner any day.
Right on.
Amazing stuff. I mean, they've gotten into it and they've sent me so much information that's helped me in my investigation. Let me make one point about the fertilizer bag. The fertilizer bag was a Bandini, and it was Fertilite.
Right.
And in the autopsy, in the coroner's autopsy, they found that she was force-fed feces. And in the description at the coroner's inquest, the Dr. Newbar is testifying, and he says, we found feces in her stomach and also a green, unidentified green material. Well, particles. Well, this Fertilite it has green particles in it to help stimulate growth in plants. So she was, in my opinion, she was force-fed the feces and fertilite from this bag at the house, and then it was used to transport her to the crime scene.
Right.
It's just, it's irrefutable evidence. I mean, that is some seriously strong evidence that George Hodel did this. I don't know how much stronger you can get. You know, again, it's just another link in the chain that you've put together here. But it's astronomical to me that anybody is sitting back going, nah, he didn't do it.
Well, let me ask people this question. Anybody that's still on the fence, and listen, it's a fine place to be. There's no, you know, you don't have to come out of this believing anything, and Steve will be the first one to tell you that. He's put together his case. But let me ask you a question. In today, let's talk about today. Let's bring that Bandolini manure receipt and the concrete bags receipt, and let's bring it into 2026. Now, first time I've said that. Okay, let's say that you have video at a Home Depot. Okay, it's a little grainy, can't really make out who it is, but there's a person at the cash register and they pay cash for a shovel. That receipt is taken by the person because they're stupid, and then it's left in their car under the floor mat, and you find it later, and a shovel was used to pre-dig a grave for a body that was later placed there. And the reason I'm using this, not 2026, but let's go back to 2006. I'm using it as an example because it was one of my cases. So if you found a receipt for a shovel underneath the floor mat of a suspect's vehicle, would that not link that person and give you a huge piece of circumstantial evidence to say, God, man, of course they did it? It's exactly what Steve did with the concrete bags and the Bandolini steer manure that were on the receipt, that were in the UCA LA files that George had in his house at the time Elizabeth Short was murdered. So how is that any different than today? That's just the point that I wanted to make.
Yeah. And
Well,
speaking of armchair detectives and stuff, and the help from readers from the outside, one of the most recent findings was remarkable, and it has to do, it's the death declaration that we have, and it's the Glenn Martin letter.
Right.
So I get an email from a woman in Chicago. I'm playing. I think it was Chicago. Judy May, and Judy May is the granddaughter of Detective Sergeant Harry Hansen, who was one of the two primary detectives that worked on and was assigned the Black Dahlia. Finus Brown was his partner, who actually did most of the work, but Harry did most of the talking. And Harry was quite a character, and he am I getting off on a different track here? Let me think a minute here. So I am. So basically, she's the granddaughter, and
let me just set this up a little bit, Steve. So all these years later, you get a letter in the mail from a woman who lives where?
It was either Philadelphia or Chicago. Maybe it was Philadelphia.
And she sends you a letter and says, I think that this pertains to your father, George Hodel. And within it, there's 3 or 4 pages that basically implicate George in Elizabeth Short's murder and others. And it was basically a cover your ass kind of letter from this man. Is that correct?
Right. Scratch the Harry Hansen. That's another aspect from another woman. But you know, you got to cut me some slack. I'm 84.
Oh,
anyway, you're right. So this was an envelope seal that she found, and it on the outside of the envelope it said, in case of the death of one of, and he names his 2 daughters, to be opened in case of the death. Well, they never died, and so the letter was never opened until 70 years later. The granddaughter finds it, and she opens it, and what does the letter say? Basically, in short, it was a lengthy letter, but basically the letter says, I was a paid informant by LAPD, working undercover to find out corruption on the department. This is in 1949. It was dated December 26th, I believe, or 23rd, 1949. Well, Dad, at that point, is on trial for the incest, and everybody's convinced he's going to be sent to prison. So Glenn Martin writes this letter, and he says, I'm friends with George. Well, he doesn't say George Hill. He says GH. He says that GH and I, GH committed the Black Dahlia murder, and he also committed the Louise Springer murder. And both GH and I knew Louise Springer personally. And he goes on to say that they were picked up and taken in and grilled on the Springer murder in June, shortly after, maybe a week after the murder, in June of 1949. And he says that GH had friends on the department who let him go. And basically, I'm writing this because he was afraid that one of his daughters, who George knew, would be killed. So he wanted to make this death declaration. Well, it was nothing happened to him. So the letter was never opened until 70 years later by the granddaughter. So she sends me the letter. And basically, it's incredible that you'd have this kind of evidence. And that was one of the new findings.
Right. Which is incredible. And the odds of GH and Black Dahlia,
Louise Springer again.
And Louise Springer. And for those of you who don't know who Louise Springer is, she was actually abducted. She and her husband were out. They stopped. He went into her beauty salon to pick up her glasses. And while he was gone, her and the car go missing. And they're found, 24 hours later, something like that?
Between 24 and 48 hours
and
later.
it's not only she's found in the car, brutally murdered, very close to where Elizabeth Short's body was dumped. And it seems very likely that it was George Hodel. So one thing, because I don't know how much time you have left, we'll be here all night if you want. A lot of people are asking about the evidence with Zodiac and as well as the DNA. We have a lot of people saying, how can LAPD not test the DNA? And you mentioned that you have George's DNA. How in the world would any police department, when you offer them DNA and say, please, I'm begging you to prove me wrong. I'm begging you to make me look like the biggest idiot on the planet. Here is George Hodel's DNA. I will pay for the tests against any one of your lone women victims, against, there were stamps, I think, that were on some of Elizabeth Short's thing. And now the Zodiac. And why would not any of these police departments not take you up on that offer? It's insanity. It's absolute insanity to me.
Well, there are a lot of, and as a ex-officer yourself, there's a lot of there's territoriality. You've got let's talk about Zodiac for a minute. You've got 5 different departments, at least, maybe more, involved in the investigation, having separate murders. You've got the traditional police territoriality, nobody's going to solve my case but me type of thing. You've got some DNA processed from different departments. None of it is confirmed Zodiac. All I got to do is match 2 of the different departments' DNA, and it's probably confirmed Zodiac. But that hasn't happened. I don't know if they've even attempted to do it. You're right. I have printed my father's DNA in my publications, in my book, his full DNA. Said, here it is. All you got to do is, look at your DNA and say, is it or isn't it? But we need confirmed DNA, which is a problem. I mean, just because they have DNA doesn't mean it's the suspects, depending on where they get it and stuff.
Somewhere, right? And so I want to backtrack a little bit on how, because Most Evil and Most Evil 2 were the books that came out that laid out the case for George Hodel being the Zodiac killer. And the first thing that you noticed was a composite, or one of the first things that you noticed was a composite drawing of George and the Zodiac suspect that the police put
You
out.
see that?
Right there.
Yeah, that's it.
So,
And that was one of the first things that caught your eye. Tell us a little bit about how you went down that road, because for me, I'm just going to say this for all of our paranormal people out there. When I hear "we'll bring you Zodiac" on the ghost boxes while we're at Soden, you will never convince me that George Hodel is not the Zodiac killer. You just won't. But Steve, tell us about real evidence.
okay. So one of Dad's unusual crime signatures was he posed his bodies near street signs as a taunting clue to the police and the press. And we don't have time to discuss all of it, but I'll just say that there were 3 murders in Chicago in 1945 and January of 1946. A little girl, Suzanne Degnan, was one of the victims, and 2 adult victims, separate. They called them bathtub murders, lipstick bathtub murders. And
Yeah.
the little girl, Suzanne Degnan, was kidnapped from her home, taken to a nearby basement. She was surgically, expertly cut up, bisected through the second and third lumbar vertebrae, which is called a hemicorporectomy. It's a surgical procedure that was taught in the 50s, but was actually performed to divide bodies in the 30s when Dad went to medical school. And he did a lot of surgery. He had 755 hours of surgery. So when these naysayers say, oh, George Hodel never had any surgical experience, that's not true. He worked as the sole surgeon in a logging camp for a year, and he had 755 hours of surgery. So anyway, her body was, and the coroner on the Suzanne Degnan said, this is so expertly done, I couldn't do as well as was done. The body was posed, parts of the body were posed off a street named Hollywood. Okay, come on, Steve. Yeah, your dad's from Hollywood, but that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? So fast forward to the Elizabeth Short, a year later, almost to the day, the Elizabeth Short murder. He posted on actually Norton, but it was actually, he thought he was on a street named Degnan. What happens, and I lay this out in my books, if you're driving north on Degnan, it splits, and if you bear to the left, it becomes Norton, and if you bear to the right, it's still Degnan. Well, he zigged instead of he zagged, and he just bared to the left and posed her body on a vacant lot, and he thought he was on Degnan. Well, he wasn't. Okay, come on, Steve, that's a bit of a stretch. Well, I've never even heard of the name Degnan. Have you?
No.
Anyway, 10 days later, 3 weeks later, he commits the Jean French murder. He poses her body on a vacant lot off a street named Mountain View. What's Mountain View? Mountain View is the grave site. What am I thinking of? Anyway, she's buried at Mountain View Cemetery. Right. Elizabeth Short's body. She's buried at Mountain View Cemetery. So that's another clue. So then there's a murder in 1967 when Dad, of course, is in Manila, Philippines. There's a murder of a young woman, kidnapped, bludgeoned, surgically bisected between the second and the third lumbar vertebrae, a hemicorporectomy. And incidentally, Elizabeth Short was also between the second and third, a hemicorporectomy. So this Lucilla Lalu in Manila is bisected. Her body is posed on a vacant lot off a street named, wait for it, Zodiac. And I'm saying to myself, no, wait a minute, Zodiac, that was a serial killer in San Francisco. I didn't know much about it. We had our own problems with Manson at the same time as the Zodiac. So I knew it was an unsolved in San Francisco, but so I started looking. I said, well, there's no way. The guy, I think he was, and I looked up, and there's a fairly young picture of a composite done by the police officer. And I'm saying, well, there's no way. Dad was 60. Yeah, he could pass for late 40s easily. But no, there's no way that he could have committed that. And then I start getting into it, and I come across this composite, which I just showed you, and it's picture perfect. Well, I discover there are two more composites by actual artists that did them, and both strongly resembled George Hodel. And I thought, oh, there's no way. Anyway, long story short, I put it all together. I come up with 32 crime signatures, MO crime signatures that match Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, and his crimes in LA. Well, as a investigator, as you know, Karen, if you get 3 or 4, you're going to say, well, we need to take a look at this guy. This could be. 32 is unheard of.
Yep.
I present all of those in letter writing, sending stuff to the relatives, taunting the police. It's all there. Basically, what George did was reinvent himself. And of course, he named himself Black Dahlia Avenger in LA, and he named himself Zodiac in San Francisco. Reinvented himself 20 years later. And he was, during these crimes, he was coming constantly as market researcher. He was constantly coming to the U.S. So he was a international serial killer, if you will.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that everybody should really pick up those 2 books because it's so compelling and it's just too expansive to go into here and now. I think there's a couple questions that
Most Evil 1 and Most Evil 2.
Yeah, Most Evil 1 and Most Evil 2. I think the most compelling, if I can say, when we were talking, and I just want our audience to hear it, the most compelling thing, and somebody asked about the Zodiac letters, is there was one Zodiac letter, the Halloween letter, I think it was, that had that funny looking cipher at the bottom. And this is after Zodiac promised that he was going to identify himself. He was going to give himself up in the very next letter. The very next letter comes out, and it's got this funny looking thing at the bottom. And we talk about this in the episodes. And what Steve finds out is that, Steve, you want to tell the story? He gets a call from...
Again, armchair detectives, right? I get a, well, first of all, let me say that Most Evil, the first book, I wrote that and published it in 2009. Dutton published it in 2009. And in that, I don't say George is Zodiac. I say there's a lot of stuff here, and it, let's do DNA, because I've made a circumstantial case, but it's not enough to say he's Zodiac. That's 2009. In 2015, I come out with Most Evil 2 and say, yeah, he is Zodiac, with the additional information. And primarily it was based on a lot of things, but mainly I get an email from a Frenchman. He's a high school teacher in Paris. And he says, I'm a student of languages. And he says, what you've got here in this cipher, this Zodiac cipher, it's funny looking cipher, he says, it's ancient Celtic language. And it's called Ogham. It looks like it's pronounced Ogham, O-G-H-A-M, but it's pronounced Ogham. He says 3rd or 4th century. And he said it's Celtic writing and there are 5 letters. And he says the letters are H-O-D-E-L. And he sends me the diagram and explains it all. We make contact back and forth. And of course, it's included. Well, I'm able to connect Dad to, in all likelihood, attending a art show from an artist in New York, where days before he mails this letter with the cipher, I'm sure he attended this art show, which was a Ogham art exhibition by an artist, surrealist artist, in just a few blocks from his office in New York. So that with the 32 crime signatures.
Such a compelling thing. Somebody else asked, and I think this is another important story that we have not put in the episode yet, but it's coming up. Somebody asked if there was any clues that George gave you in the last 10 years why you were so close to him. And I think one of the most compelling stories that you've told us that has not appeared in the episode yet is the hot air balloon ride. And maybe you could tell our people about that episode.
So yeah, actually that was, when was that? That was actually while I was still on LAPD. I think it was here when he was here on one of his regular visits. His MO would be to never give any advance warning. It was, he had 11 children by 5 different women, and I was his favorite, go figure. Well, maybe I wasn't his favorite. Maybe he actually wanted to know what I knew or didn't know. That may have been the reality there in retrospect. But anyway, he would call me up. He'd say, get your brothers together. Let's meet for dinner. And I'm just here for a few days. I'm on my way to New York, that type of thing. And he did this multiple times a year. So he was in San Francisco and with June, and he invited me up to visit them. So I drove up, and I think I was there 3 or 4 days. Anyway, he had a surprise for me. He said, be here at the hotel, whatever it was, 7 in the morning. Got a surprise. So I show up, and off we go across the Golden Gate to Marin County. And he's arranged a balloon ride. And I thought, how cool is this? And so the 3 of us get in this air balloon with the balloonist, aerialist, balloonist, and we take off and we go over kind of the whole area there surrounding Oakland and the fields there and stuff. And of course, that was fun, and I didn't think much about it. And then fast forward to my Zodiac investigation. And then I realized the good doctor has got his big city homicide detective at his side, and we're floating over his killing fields. Basically, several of the Zodiac murders occurred over there in that area. And talk about an ego. He must have really getting off.
Yeah, the entire killing fields of the Zodiac, minus I think 1, were all up in that area. Elizabeth Short is buried up in that area, and he's basically going, hey, look what I'm going to take you across.
The whole Mount Diablo, everything.
Yeah.
All of it.
And as you told us, it was kind of like he had this Cheshire cat smile on his face the whole time, just watching you. It's a little crazy.
All right.
Well, I mean, it's part of the catch me if you can mentality he had. Not only is he taunting the police, he's unknowingly taunting his big city detective, doesn't have a clue about, and incidentally, just as so you know, he supposedly the records show that he died of a heart attack at 91. Actually, he committed suicide. He took an overdose of pills. He was writing prescriptions to June for Seconal, and when she amassed enough, he took an overdose and actually left a note, which is included in Black Dahlia Avenger as a kind of a mysterious, all kinds of different clues and stuff.
There was also the most important thing that he did was he didn't want any type of memorial. He didn't want the family getting together talking, because when somebody has told lies or different stories to everybody, the last thing you want is for everybody to get together and go, well, wait, he told me this, he told me that. Wait. And George never wanted you guys to discover who he really was all those years, beyond being your friend.
And actually, he copied, it was almost verbatim instructions to June from the Marquis de Sade. This was almost a verbatim. He says, I want no funeral, I want no visitors, I want no mourning. And then he instructed her to burn all of his possessions, which brings us to the photo book album. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm down with June, and we're doing all the things, and she's of course she's thinking of committing suicide herself, and I'm talking her out of that, trying to talk her out of it. And she comes out and she hands me a small 3 by 5 inch photo album. And she says, I think your father would want you to have this. And it's a small album, and I open it up and I'm looking through it, and there are pictures, some Man Ray pictures of the family, of us 3 boys, my mother, my grandfather, Dad's father. And then I come across a photo of a nude reclining woman, and I didn't recognize it. And I said, June, who is this? She looks at it and she says, somebody your father knew from a long time ago. And to this day, I can't say why, but it came and it left. It was like Black Dahlia comes to my mind. This is just before I have the conversation with Tamar, but it comes in and out, and I don't think much of it. Now, did I hear something as a little boy that photo reminded me of? Can't say. I won't say because I have, I have no real memory of it. But it did come and go instantly. And then, of course, shortly after that, I'm on the phone with Tamar, and she says what she says. Anyway, I have this, and it looks a lot like Elizabeth Short, at least to my mind, once I got into the investigation. So fast forward to a couple of weeks ago. The photo has been very controversial. A lot of people look at it. Half of the people look at it and say, no way, it's not Elizabeth Short. The other half say, yeah, I think it is Elizabeth Short. It's posed, she's reclining, her eyes are shut. And I had it analyzed by the top facial recognition laboratory in Germany. And a Dr. Robert Frischholz did the analysis. And he compared it to 3 or 4 known photographs of Elizabeth Short. And the results are that it comes back 95 to 97% positive that it is Elizabeth Short. Well, you need 99.7 is my understanding, but clearly 95 to 97 is hugely identical, let's say, if not a match. And then recently I had another independent individual run it through AI comparison. I think it's Grok or something. Anyway, his results, he ran it to photographs, her booking photograph, and photographs from the Marshall High School in front of that. Anyway, it came back with a 99% match. So we've got somewhere between 97 and 99% positive match that it's Elizabeth Short. And I believe it's Elizabeth Short. I think she's either unconscious or dead. I think it was a death trophy, if you will, that he took.
One of the compelling things that came out in the recent things that you did was the fact, and I never noticed it, that all the facial muscles were completely relaxed. So either she was unconscious or dead, because we all have, I don't care how old or young you are, we all have facial muscles that, cause creases or whatever when you are alert. So this was not somebody who was just laying there with their eyes closed posed. This is definitely somebody, if you look closely at this, there's no facial muscle at all. So
That's right.
She's either unconscious or dead, one of the two.
And there are additional linkage besides that. So that's the first. The second is, if you look carefully and you blow up the mouth, you'll see the lipstick was applied by somebody else. It wasn't applied by her. No woman would put lipstick on the way it does. And this links into Man Ray's Lover's Lips, which is a pair of lips floating, red lips floating on the horizon on one of his famous paintings. So there's that. There's also a third linkage where in the photograph you can see she's wearing a pearl earring in the photograph. And also in the autopsy photographs, they happen to have one where it showed when it bloated up, appears that that earring was taken off and placed inside her ear. Now it's a bit blurry, but you can see the comparisons in my enlargements. And
you guys go into Steve's book. What he's saying is he zoomed in on the body of Elizabeth Short. He zoomed in, took the photos, kept going tighter and tighter and tighter. And as he got very close, he could see an earring inside the ear that had either fallen in or been placed there. And it matches the earring in this photo.
Right.
So
I don't believe it fell in. I think it was deliberately a part of the posing, deliberately taking and posing this instrument, just like he did. And we haven't even talked about all of the connections and linkage on the various wounds that he inflicted and as they relate to surrealism. I'm coming out with a new book. Oh my gosh. I promise it'll be my last. I think this will do it.
Don't let it be.
And it deals with a lot with that. I won't go into the details, but I hope to have it out in the next month or so.
Oh, great.
I think the other really important thing before we let you go, because I know you're getting tired, that small photo album that you had, there was also a variety of pictures in there. And I'm bringing this up because I think it goes into some of our later episodes and some of the stuff that Karen has found. And people also asking, how did George have, all this power? There were other men in those photographs that you suspect as being who? Do you know off the top of your head? We have Kent Kane Parrott. Is that correct?
Yeah, those photos weren't they weren't in the album, were they? I'm trying to remember. Those were photographs that took in the 1920s. They were part of his photography. He was also a photographer. He had his own art shows in Pasadena and downtown LA with his artwork, his photography. And these were, I'm trying to remember, were they in the album?
I think you're right. They were in a strange album that he was taking when he was doing the selfie back in the 1920s, which is crazy.
Right. These were part of his 1920s. But yes, I believe one is the young Fred Sexton, who we haven't really talked about, but just so your viewers know, Sexton, I believe, was an accomplice to George. I think they committed a lot of murders together. I believe Sexton committed separate murders on his own. It's a little bit difficult because there's so many murders. Many of them have two men committing them.
I was going to say, so many of the witnesses said 2 men, 1 woman for each time, one of these women were killed. And so it's almost, to a point where you got to go, who's the other man? Who's the other woman? And your position is at least the other man is probably Fred Sexton, possibly the Baron at times, but Fred.
But these photos that you're talking about were definitely gangsters from the 1920s. And one, I believe, is a close match. I haven't done a facial recognition, but I'm sure it's Kent Kane Parrott. Yeah. My middle name is Kent. Has to make me wonder where that came from.
Yes.
And basically, Kent Kane Parrott was owned Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s. And he owned half the LAPD, was on the take. He was the real mayor of Los Angeles. And he was, you can look him up. There's a lot about him. He was the silent power behind the throne in the 20s and 30s. And this picture that Dad has was probably taken during his time as a reporter and stuff, that he took these of these guys, and they all look like gangsters.
He was. I mean, you have Jack Dragna, who was running everything in LA in the 20s. Then you had Albert Marco, who's running the gambling and prostitution. Then you have a couple of the others, Guy McAfee, who was vice, who turned into a syndicate member. You have Tony Canero, who's rum running all over the coast. And then you had Kent Kane Parrott, who's silently pulling the puppet strings behind the scenes with the DA's office, with the politicos, with the police department, with everybody else. So he's the silent partner in the background, just fixing everything and making sure everybody's happy and getting their cuts and all that other crap. So that's who Kent Kane Parrott was.
And here he is in George Hodel's
photo album.
Personal photographs of him. Clearly they were associated in some way, if not good buddies. But and that was when Dad was like 20 years old, you know.
But the foundation, and he did that not only while he was working for the newspaper, but then also when he was driving taxis. And this is where he made, you know, he was on the Vice when he was working newspapers. He got to do ride-alongs with LAPD, and then he moved to the Murder Squad. And then, so he's making all of these connections. So all you people that asked earlier, how is he so powerful? Here's another way that he's powerful. In his younger years, he is making all
He's
these
networking.
Yeah, he's making all of these connections.
100%.
So I
Charlie
think that's,
Crawford, everybody.
yeah, it's really important, and we start to get into that more and more as our episodes for the show go.
Right.
To support, you know, kind of everything that Steve's laid out for us.
Yeah, that's a big part of the history of Los Angeles that not a lot of people know about. So that's great that you're going to be covering some of that, because LA was, you know, super corrupt back in those days, and you can't take today's LA and think in those terms. You have to think of the terms of the 1920s and 30s and 40s.
Right. Yeah. I wrote, I think it was 42 pages today on 20s and 30s corruption in LA. That's what I spent today.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah.
So Steve, our people are asking is if we can come back and do another live with you just about Zodiac. So I'm hoping that you'll do that. And I just want to thank you. We've taken up 2 hours and 5 minutes of your time.
Oh, no, I'm happy to do it. You two have been such good, strong supporters of me for so many years. And we're, you know, I just love that you've supported me as much as you have. One thing quick about the Zodiac, just to make it clear, because it's kind of been in the headlines lately that somebody else has solved it and saying that there's a link between the Zodiac and the same killer is Zodiac and Black Dahlia. And I published my first book, Most Evil, came out in 2009, and the second, Most Evil 2, where I say he actually did do it and present all the evidence, came out in 2015. So that's 11 years ago when I said, yes, he's absolutely, he did both murders. So whatever this guy is saying about them connected, he's got that part right. He's just got the wrong suspect. He's taken a lot of my work and basically transferred it to this other suspect who was
and just put in another suspect and some AI and no work at all. But hey, we'll talk about that on the next episode.
Yeah, and I'd like to toss this in because, you know, I do support Steve, and you know, we as investigators will disagree. We disagree about certain things, and we have our little debates online and emails, and we respect each other quite a bit. And I will say this in defense of this subject, and I'm going to shut up. What I'm going to say is that when you have a theory that feels comfortable and has no institutional risk associated with it, people glom on. That is a hell of a lot different than a 26-year investigation, tons of circumstantial and direct and primary source evidence. There is a huge difference here. And comfort is one of the reasons that some people have come out in support of this instead of vetoing somebody's work over 26 years, perhaps as an investigator and as armchair detectives and people who can be objective and look at stuff. Perhaps you should read the books and follow the evidence instead of being comfortable. And that's all I'm going to say about it.
But we'll
I love you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you. And I totally support you. And I hope to see you guys in this year, in this new year.
Love that.
We're hoping you're going to come to LA. Thank you to everybody and all your questions. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight and being with us. Steve, can't thank you enough. Can't thank you for all that you've helped us with in what we're doing. And guys, yes, we're definitely going to do another one with Steve sometime soon, and we'll talk about the Zodiac. Thanks, Steve. Love you.
Okay. Love you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.